On a humid evening in the summer of 1982, a family dinner unfolded quietly on the south side of Savannah, Georgia. 3 generations sat around the same table, bound by a shared history the city itself preferred not to remember. By the end of that week, multiple bodies would be discovered across county lines, connected not by gangs, drugs, or money, but by something far older and far more dangerous. Authorities would later struggle to explain the sequence of deaths. No witnesses, no clear suspects, no public motive, just a pattern that moved patiently through bloodlines, as if following rules written long before modern law ever arrived. Savannah officials would describe it as a series of unrelated homicides. Locals would call it something else entirely, because this wasn't a crime wave, it wasn't chaos, and it wasn't revenge in the way most people understand it. It began with a word, spoken casually at the wrong table. What followed erased more than lives. It erased entire family lines, leaving behind only silence, closed records, and a city that learned once again what not to say. Before we continue with the video, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Savannah, Georgia. Summer of 1982. The heat that year didn't arrive suddenly. It settled in slowly, day after day, until it felt permanent, like something the city would never shake off. Even at night, the air stayed thick, clinging to skin, clothing, and temper alike. In Savannah, heat had a way of loosening tongues and tightening memories. And memories, in that city, were never harmless. The Whitaker house stood on a quiet street south of downtown. A narrow, aging structure expanded over decades to hold a family that refused to scatter. 3 generations lived there, not because they couldn't leave, but because they believed separation weakened things that were meant to stay intact. The house had rules. Some were spoken, most were not. That Friday evening began the way so many others had. Fried chicken rested on paper towels, grease soaking through. Collard greens steamed gently. Sweet tea filled glasses already sweating in the heat. The television murmured in the background, ignored. This wasn't a night for noise. It was a night for familiarity. Earl Whitaker sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid despite his age. His hands were thick, scarred, steady. He rarely spoke during meals. He believed listening revealed more than talking ever could. Born before the war, raised in a Savannah that resolved its problems quietly, Earl carried himself like a man who had seen things handled without witnesses. To his right sat his son, Harold, 48 years old, dock worker. Broad shoulders, calm eyes, a face shaped by long hours and longer patience. Harold believed in order, in responsibility, in finishing what was started, once it was clear it needed finishing. Across from him sat Calvin. Calvin was different. He had left Savannah at 18 and returned with ideas that didn't always fit the table he grew up at. He spoke faster, asked questions, believed distance softened old conflicts. At 26, he still carried the confidence of someone who thought time solved problems on its own. The conversation drifted harmlessly at first. Complaints about work, a neighbor's dog, news from Atlanta. Laughter rose and fell without meaning. Then Calvin mentioned a name. It was casual, almost careless. He brought up an old dispute involving another family, a boundary argument that had existed before he was born. To Calvin, it was a story, something outdated, something worth joking about. And then he said the word. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't aggressive. It came out clean and unguarded, as if it had no history attached to it at all. The effect was immediate. Earl's hand stopped halfway to his glass. Harold froze, his jaw tightening just slightly. A fork clinked against a plate and fell silent. No one spoke, no one moved. Calvin noticed the change and smiled, confused. "What?" he asked. "What did I say?" No one answered, because everyone at that table knew what he had said, and more importantly, what it meant. That word wasn't offensive in the way outsiders would understand. It didn't insult character. It didn't provoke pride. It questioned something deeper, something that, once questioned, demanded a response. Earl finally lifted his glass and took a slow sip. He didn't look at Calvin. He didn't need to. Harold glanced at his son, then away. His silence wasn't confusion, it was recognition. Calvin tried again. He laughed, waved his hand. "I didn't mean it like that," he said. "You know that, right?" Earl set his glass down. That sound, glass on wood, carried more weight than any shout ever could. Dinner ended early. Plates were cleared, leftovers wrapped, chairs pushed in. There was no argument, no lecture, no warning. Everyone behaved as if the evening had simply reached its natural end. Calvin went to his room uneasy but unconcerned. He assumed he had brushed against something sensitive. Old people did that. Old families did that. He didn't understand yet. Later that night, long after the house had gone quiet, Earl and Harold sat at the kitchen table. The air between them was heavy, familiar. He didn't know, Harold said. Earl nodded. That never stopped it before. Harold didn't argue. They didn't discuss details. They didn't need to. The path ahead wasn't invented. It was remembered. A pattern that had existed before Calvin was born, before Harold was grown, before Earl had gray in his hair. In Savannah, certain words didn't express opinions. They issued declarations. 2 days later, the first body was found behind an abandoned service station on the edge of the city. One gunshot wound, close range, clean. The victim's name meant nothing to the public, but to the Whitakers, it fit perfectly. Savannah's police marked it as a targeted killing, likely personal, likely isolated. The city kept moving. Inside the Whitaker house, no one spoke of it. Calvin read about it in the paper and felt a flicker of discomfort he couldn't explain. Something about the name bothered him, something familiar. He folded the paper and told himself it was coincidence. Savannah was full of coincidences. By the time the second body appeared, no one at that table needed confirmation. The word had done what it always did, and this time, it wasn't going to stop halfway. Savannah did not wake up afraid. The morning after the first body was found, traffic moved as usual. Shop owners lifted their shutters. Churches unlocked their doors. The city had learned over generations how to absorb violence without letting it interrupt routine. Fear in Savannah was private. Publicly, life continued. The man behind the service station had a name, a job history, a family tree that stretched thin but recognizable through county records. To most people, he was forgettable. To the police, he was a problem that needed a label. They found one quickly. Personal dispute. No signs of struggle. No witnesses, no immediate threat to public safety. The case was logged, discussed briefly, then set aside. Savannah had seen worse. What the city did not see, or chose not to, was the way certain neighborhoods reacted. Doors closed earlier, conversations shortened, names were avoided. People who understood the old language recognized the shape of what was happening. The Whitakers felt it too. Earl read the paper silently at breakfast, folding it neatly once he reached the bottom of the article. Harold watched him, waiting for some signal. None came. Calvin stood near the sink, nursing a cup of coffee, scanning the same article with growing discomfort. "That's the guy I mentioned," he said carefully. "From the story, that family." Harold didn't answer. Earl looked up slowly, his eyes settling on Calvin with something that wasn't anger, but disappointment. "Stories don't end when you stop telling them," Earl said. "They wait." Calvin opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. For the first time since returning to Savannah, he felt genuinely out of place in his own home. The second killing came 4 nights later. This one was different. The body was found near the river, closer to the historic district, older, well-known. A man whose name still appeared in church donation lists and zoning meetings. The wound was the same, single shot, close range, but the message was louder. Now detectives paid attention. 2 men, connected not by profession or location, but by family history. Old records revealed a thread stretching back decades, shared disputes, unresolved boundaries, quiet settlements no one liked to revisit. Savannah's police department was experienced enough to know what this meant. This wasn't escalation, it was sequence. Detective Lawrence Bennett had been on the force long enough to recognize patterns others ignored. He spread files across his desk late into the night, mapping names instead of locations. Grandfathers, sons, grandsons. His stomach tightened. 3 generations, he thought. Someone is moving through time, not territory. He requested older case files, accidents, disappearances, closed investigations from the 40s and 60s. Names reappeared with disturbing consistency. The Whitakers' name surfaced quietly, not as suspects, as constants. Bennett visited the Whitaker house 2 days later. Harold answered the door, calm, polite, unbothered. "We're just asking questions," Bennett said. "I understand," Harold replied. "You always are." They spoke on the porch. Bennett asked about the victims. Harold acknowledged knowing them. Nothing more, nothing less. Inside, Earl sat at the table, listening without appearing to. Calvin stayed in his room. Bennett left with no evidence, and a growing certainty that evidence wouldn't come easily. That night, Savannah whispered, people talked in kitchens and cars. Not about fear, about caution. Parents reminded children not to repeat old insults. Men lowered their voices when names surfaced. The city remembered what its records didn't show. The third killing wasn't discovered immediately. The man disappeared first. A younger one, a son. the last living link of the family Calvin had spoken about. When his truck was found abandoned outside the county line, Bennett already knew what he'd find. The body lay further out, where the city gave way to quiet roads and marshland. Same precision, same restraint. Now there was no doubt. This wasn't revenge in the way people understood it. There was no rage in it, no chaos. It felt like obligation. Calvin broke that night. He confronted Harold in the kitchen, his voice shaking. "This is because of me," he said. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Harold leaned against the counter, eyes steady. "Knowing isn't what matters," he said. "Remembering is." Calvin packed a bag. He didn't announce it. He didn't ask permission. He just knew he couldn't stay. Savannah suddenly felt smaller than ever. Every street a reminder, every name a warning. He planned to leave before dawn. Earl watched him from the doorway as Calvin zipped the bag closed. "Running doesn't unsay a word," Earl said quietly. Calvin stopped, his hands trembling. "Then tell me how to fix it." Earl's expression didn't change. "You can't fix something that was already decided." Outside, Savannah slept. Inside that house, 3 generations understood something different, that the city wasn't reacting to violence. It was recognizing it, and the pattern wasn't finished yet. The third body was discovered in the same quiet way the others had been. No fanfare, no dramatic discovery. Just the body, lying discarded, found too far from town to be a simple coincidence. And like the others, the death didn't raise questions. It raised a conclusion. Detective Bennett was no longer playing catch-up. He knew what he was looking at, but he didn't know how to explain it. How could he? What he was seeing wasn't a crime. It wasn't even a series of crimes. It was something deeper, something with roots in history, in families, in bloodlines that ran too thick to erase. 3 bodies in 6 days. Each man tied to the Whitaker name. Each death measured, deliberate. Each one left unanswered. No real investigation. No press conference. Just silence. The city had grown used to this. The Whitakers had been here for decades, but no one seemed to remember them until now. And what was remembered wasn't the calm family of old. It was something more dangerous. The word Calvin had said, all those days ago, hadn't just ignited a spark. It had pulled at the seams of Savannah's collective memory, dragging things out from the shadows that should have stayed there. And now, Calvin was gone. Gone without a word to anyone. He had packed up, like a man leaving town for good, not even looking back. But no one could run from what they had started, not when it had been set in motion so long ago. By now, Harold knew there was no escaping this. The weight of it settled in his chest, like the first heavy rains of a storm. He could feel the pressure building, could hear the distant rumble of what was coming. He didn't say anything to Earl. He didn't need to. They knew. Earl had known since Calvin first spoke that word, and Harold had known since the 60s, when their own blood had made the same mistakes. In their family, nothing was ever truly forgotten. Everything lived on. Everything was remembered, no matter how much time passed. Harold stood on the porch, staring out into the street. The wind was picking up, a harbinger of rain. There were no cars in sight, just the stillness of Savannah. Earl joined him. For a moment, neither spoke, but the silence was heavy with understanding. "Do you think he'll come back?" Harold finally asked, his voice low. Earl shook his head slowly. "When a word is said, it can't be unsaid. And when something is started, it doesn't end until it's finished." That night, Harold locked the door and sat in the living room, waiting. Earl retired to his chair, eyes closing as he let the silence wash over him. It was strange how the silence had become so comfortable, how it wrapped itself around them, almost like a second skin. The next morning, the phone rang. Harold's hand froze as he reached for the receiver. It was a number he didn't recognize. His instincts told him to let it ring, to ignore it. But something told him this call would be different. This was the call that would change everything. "Harold Whitaker?" the voice on the other end asked, sharp and direct. "Yes," Harold replied, already bracing himself for what he knew was coming. "We have Calvin." Harold's heart skipped. "What do you want with him? He's not your problem anymore." The line went dead. It took only a few minutes for Harold to gather what he needed. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his hands were steady. Earl was already waiting for him by the door. "Get in the truck," Earl said, his voice gruff but calm. There was no question, no hesitation. It was simply what they had always done. Harold climbed into the truck. As the engine roared to life, the world outside felt both distant and urgent. The tires crunched against the gravel as they drove, not in the direction of downtown Savannah, but away from it, into the outskirts, into the marshland, into a place where nothing could be hidden. As they drove, Harold's mind raced. He knew what this meant. They knew what Calvin had done. But this wasn't about right or wrong. This was about survival, about keeping what was theirs, about protecting the family from something that had been coming for decades. They reached the outskirts of the city. The truck bumped along an old dirt road, long forgotten by anyone who wasn't looking for it. Harold's eyes scanned the horizon. His pulse quickened. There, in the distance, through the trees, he saw them, the men. They didn't move. They didn't speak. Harold stopped the truck a few feet away, his hand on the door handle. Earl's eyes were fixed ahead, unblinking. "Are you ready?" Harold asked, though he already knew the answer. Earl didn't reply. He didn't need to. The old man had been ready for years. Harold took a deep breath, and together they stepped out of the truck. To the Whitakers, the word that had been spoken wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was a call to action. And no one knew better than them that when a decision like this was made, there was no turning back. Savannah had seen enough violence to know that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The morning after they left, the city of Savannah carried on as though nothing had changed. It always did. The news reported nothing about Calvin's disappearance. No mention of the other bodies. No acknowledgement of the Whitaker name beyond the usual exchanges of small-town gossip. To the people living in the heart of the city, everything was normal. The streets hummed with activity. The sun shone through the thick air, and life continued, just as it always had. But for those who remembered, the silence was deafening. Harold and Earl returned to the house before dark. They didn't speak of what had happened. The truck parked in front of the house, the engine cut, and the night fell without a word exchanged. Inside, Earl resumed his seat at the table. He looked like he always did, composed, steady, unyielding, but something had shifted. Harold could feel it. Calvin was gone. The pattern had been completed, but there was a strange emptiness now. The thing they had always prepared for had come to pass, yet it felt hollow. There was no triumph, no victory, just the aftermath of a decision made long ago. The following days blurred into one another. The news came and went. Work continued. Neighbors waved from their porches, oblivious to the drama unfolding behind the walls of the Whitaker house. To them, the Whitakers were just another family who kept to themselves. But Harold knew better. He knew the cost of silence. That night, Harold went out alone, walking down familiar streets, past shops and homes, until he reached the riverbank. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the water, but Harold barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere. His father's words echoed in his head. When something is started, it doesn't end until it's finished. Had it been finished? Had they really corrected what needed correcting? Or had something been left incomplete, hanging in the air like the fog that rose off the river in the mornings? As he stood there, staring out at the water, Harold realized that the violence, the loss, the silence, none of it had solved anything. It had only settled the surface of a deeper, more complex wound. A wound that went back farther than he'd ever cared to acknowledge. He thought of his own father, Earl's generation, the men who had fought in the war, the ones who had learned that silence was strength, that violence had its place, but could never be fully trusted. His father had lived by those rules, had made sure Harold and Calvin learned them too. But now, it felt like a lie. What was it all for? Harold's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He didn't turn, but he knew who it was. "Earl, never thought I'd see you out here," Earl said, his voice low but steady. "I had to think," Harold replied, "and it's quiet out here." The two of them stood side by side, gazing at the water. Neither said anything for a long while. "I'm sorry about Calvin," Earl finally said. "He wasn't ready for this." Harold's throat tightened. He had wanted to say something similar, but hearing it from Earl made the reality of the situation hit harder than he'd expected. Calvin had been too young, too full of idealism, too full of hope that things could change. And maybe he'd been right, in a way, but now it was too late. "What happens now?" Harold asked, the question hanging in the thick, humid air. Earl paused before answering. "What happens now is we keep going. We keep living." Harold turned to look at his father. The lines on his face deepened by years of struggle, but his eyes still unwavering. "We've always known what's coming," Earl continued. "There's no use pretending otherwise." Harold wanted to argue, to say that they could change things, that they could find another way. But something about the way Earl spoke made him pause. His father wasn't just talking about this moment. He was talking about the whole history that led up to it. A history of violence and silence, of things unspoken and unresolved. "It doesn't have to be like this," Harold said quietly. "Does it?" Earl's expression softened slightly, but the edge in his voice remained. "You're asking the wrong question," Earl said. "The real question is, what happens if we stop?" Harold frowned, confused. "If we stop," Earl continued, "we lose everything we've fought for. You think this city is any different from when I was a boy? You think those families that you're so eager to forgive are going to let us forget who we are?" Harold stared at his father, the weight of those words sinking in. They were right. The city might change, but some things would never change. The deep, persistent wounds of the past would always be there, whether they acknowledged them or not. If the Whitakers stopped, If they softened, the city would swallow them whole. And that wasn't something Earl was willing to let happen. Harold nodded slowly, resigned to the harsh truth. "I understand." Earl didn't say anything more. Instead, he placed a hand on Harold's shoulder, a gesture of both comfort and finality. The decision had been made. There was no going back. The two men walked back to the house, their silhouettes outlined against the dimming sky, the weight of the world heavy on their shoulders. In the distance, the river still flowed, but it felt colder now, as if even the water could sense the shift in the air. Inside, the house felt more oppressive than ever. Calvin was gone. The city had returned to its rhythm, and the Whitakers were left to carry on. But as Harold sat back in his chair that night, staring out the window at the empty street, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end. It was just the calm before the storm. Years later, when the case resurfaced, it didn't feel like an investigation. It felt like an excavation. Detective Lawrence Bennett was close to retirement when he asked for the files. Not because anyone expected answers, but because unanswered things had a way of growing heavier with age. The folders came from the lowest level of storage, the kind reserved for cases that embarrassed no one, precisely because they had never been solved. On paper, the events of 1982 looked unremarkable. 3 murders, 1 disappearance, no arrests, no suspects officially named. The language was dry, procedural, almost apologetic. What struck Bennett immediately was how clean it all was. No messy timelines, no emotional witness statements, no desperate appeals from families. The case didn't scream failure, it whispered restraint. He spread the photographs across the table slowly, as if movement itself required permission. Different faces, different ages, different addresses. Nothing visually connected them, but the manner of death did. Close-range shots, controlled angles, no hesitation, no excess. Whoever pulled the trigger wasn't proving anything. They were finishing something. Bennett had worked homicides long enough to recognize what wasn't there. There was no rage in these deaths, no signature, no compulsion. Serial killers needed repetition, revenge killers needed release. This didn't need either. This was obligation carried out with discipline. As he read through the witness statements again, the silences became louder than the words. People had been interviewed, neighbors, co-workers, acquaintances. Everyone saw nothing, heard nothing, remembered nothing. Savannah had always been skilled at selective memory. It wasn't fear-driven, it was cultural. A city raised to understand that some truths were safer, left unnamed. One statement, buried deep in the file, stopped him. An elderly woman, interviewed briefly after the second killing. She hadn't described the shooter. She hadn't described the sound. She had only said calmly that some families didn't argue when lines were crossed. They concluded. At the time, the officer had marked it as irrelevant. Bennett circled it in red ink decades later. When he reached the Whitaker file, the pattern solidified. Earl Whitaker had no criminal record, yet his name appeared repeatedly in proximity to accidents and unfortunate incidents spanning nearly 40 years. Events that never quite rose to suspicion, but never quite dissolved into randomness either. Earl's death, listed as natural causes, came weeks after the final killing. Peaceful, convenient, final. Harold Whitaker had vanished soon after. No bank activity, no forwarding address, no signs of panic. It looked less like flight and more like completion. As if once the task was done, the man simply stepped away from the world that required him. Calvin's name ended the file differently. No body recovered, no official cause, just absence. A young man who believed words lost power with distance, erased by a system that remembered better than he did. Bennett leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, feeling something he hadn't allowed himself to feel during his career. Not fear. Respect was too strong a word. It was recognition. The realization that what happened in Savannah wasn't a failure of justice, but an alternative form of it, one that existed parallel to the law, older than it, quieter than it, and far more efficient. He checked the dates again. 1949, 1967, 1982. Each incident separated by time, not chance. Each triggered by the same invisible act. A word spoken without permission. A boundary crossed by someone who believed history was negotiable. The law had no vocabulary for this kind of violence. There was no statute for inherited memory, no charge for enforcing silence. The Whitakers hadn't challenged the system. They had worked around it, trusting that Savannah would do what it always did, look away, just enough. When Bennett signed off on the review, his hand hesitated. The sentence he wrote was short, final, and deeply dishonest. No further action recommended. He hated it. But he also knew that reopening the case wouldn't bring truth. It would only force the city to admit something it had already accepted. That evening, he drove past the old Whitaker house. New people lived there now. Lights on, music playing, children's voices spilling onto the street. The house looked smaller than memory had made it, less imposing, almost ordinary. That somehow was the most disturbing part. Bennett sat in his car for a long moment, engine running, watching the front door. He imagined a future dinner table, new names, new conversations, and somewhere, someday, someone saying something they didn't understand. He drove away, knowing one thing for certain: the Whitakers were gone. But Savannah had learned their lesson well, and lessons like that don't disappear, they wait. Savannah has changed since 1982, at least on the surface. New buildings rose where old ones once leaned. Streets were repaved. Families came and went, bringing different accents, different habits, different assumptions about what kind of city this was. Time did what time always does best. It covered things. It softened edges. It convinced people that whatever happened before them belonged to someone else. But Savannah never erased anything. It only buried it carefully. The Whitaker house eventually stopped being called that. It became just another address, another place where lights turned on at dusk and off again before morning. Children played in the yard where men once stood, making decisions that would ripple through decades. No plaque marked what had happened there. No warning lived in the walls. The city preferred it that way. Those who remembered grew old. Some died. Others learned not to talk. Yet even as the names faded, the behavior remained. Savannah taught its newcomers quickly, without explanation. Certain jokes didn't land. Certain histories weren't worth revisiting. Certain words, though no one could quite say why, carried a weight that made conversations stop cold. People learned through instinct, not instruction. A bar would go quiet. A table would fall silent. A look would be exchanged. That said enough. No one ever mentioned the Whitakers outright. They didn't have to. The lesson had detached itself from the family and embedded itself into the city itself. It became cultural memory, stripped of faces, but not of consequence. Years after Detective Bennett retired, a younger officer would stumble across the same files during a routine audit. He would skim them quickly, unimpressed. Old cases, no suspects, no leads. He would miss what Bennett had seen, because he didn't know how to look for absence. He didn't understand that the most important things in those folders weren't written down. The city didn't need the records anymore. It carried the rule internally now. On warm summer nights, conversations still drifted the way they always had. Drinks sweating onto tables, laughter rising and falling, familiar rhythms repeating themselves. Savannah looked peaceful in those moments, almost gentle, a city at ease with itself. And then, sometimes, someone would say something, not with malice, not with intent, just ignorance. A careless word borrowed from a story they didn't understand, spoken in a place that remembered too well. The reaction was never loud. Someone would clear their throat. Someone else would change the subject. A chair might scrape the floor as a person stood up earlier than planned. Nothing dramatic happened right away. It never did. Savannah wasn't impulsive. It had never needed to be. The city understood timing the way only old places do. It knew that consequences didn't have to arrive quickly to be permanent. Those who sensed the shift often couldn't explain it later. They would only describe a feeling, a sense that something had moved, quietly, behind the scenes, a door closing, a decision settling into place. Most of the time, nothing followed. The word faded. The night ended. Life went on. But occasionally someone left town unexpectedly. A business closed without explanation. A name stopped appearing where it once had. People noticed, then stopped noticing. Savannah was good at that too. What happened in 1982 was never repeated exactly. It didn't need to be. The example had been sufficient. 3 generations erased not out of anger, but out of adherence. Not because the city demanded it, but because the city understood it. Savannah had learned that order didn't always come from law, and justice didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived quietly, wearing patience instead of rage, memory instead of motive. And the most dangerous words weren't shouted, they were spoken casually, at dinner tables, by people who believed history was finished with them. In Savannah, it never was. The city still listens, and somewhere, beneath the music and the laughter and the warm southern nights, it still waits, not for violence, not for blood, but for the next reminder that some words, once spoken, never truly leave the room.